My name is Angelica, and at 30 years old, I thought my birthday would be quiet but still meaningful. I had prepared a small cake the night before, expecting maybe a few friends or family to drop by. I should have felt content sitting in my warm apartment, but all I could see was the empty space where celebration should have been. The chairs I had set out remained untouched. The frosting on the cake began to harden, and the silence was louder than any storm outside. My birthday meant everything to me, but apparently nothing to them. The real gut punch came 2 days later when the evacuation order was issued and I found myself standing in the rain at the community center, watching the last bus pull away with my mother and sister on board. If you have ever felt abandoned by the people who should have been your strongest allies, let me know where you are watching from. Hit that like button and subscribe to join a community who understands that family betrayal cuts deeper than any other wound. For the past 4 years, I had lived alone in a modest second-floor apartment on the edge of the city. It was not glamorous, but it was mine. 2 small bedrooms, a narrow kitchen, and a window overlooking a row of old maple trees that turned gold in the fall. I worked as an administrative coordinator at a nonprofit organization, steady work that paid my bills and gave me enough breathing room to save for small luxuries. My circle of friends was small but loyal, and my contact with my family was limited mostly to obligatory holiday visits. The storm had been in the forecast for days, a massive weather system crawling toward us with heavy rain and rising winds. The river that bordered the downtown area had already been creeping higher each day, and the city's levees were beginning to show signs of strain. Officials urged people in low-lying neighborhoods to prepare for possible evacuation. My street wasn't in the immediate danger zone yet, but the warnings were becoming more urgent with each passing hour. When the official evacuation alert came, it was short and clear: gather essentials and proceed to the nearest evacuation point. Mine was just 2 blocks away. I packed deliberately, trying to keep calm: a change of clothes, my passport, a flashlight, some snacks, bottled water, and a waterproof envelope with old photographs. I slipped on my rain jacket and boots, locked the door behind me, and headed into the downpour. The scene at the community center was chaos. Families huddled together under the overhang, clutching pets in carriers and bags stuffed with clothing. Volunteers in reflective vests shouted instructions over the wind, guiding people into an orderly line for the buses. I spotted my mother and my younger sister near the front. My sister looked as if she had stepped out of a magazine spread, her hair still mostly dry beneath her hood, while my mother stood protectively at her side. The first bus rolled in, headlights slicing through the rain. Volunteers began counting passengers as they boarded. The line moved quickly, but the bus was nearly full by the time they reached the front. There was space for just one more passenger. My mother stepped forward, steering my sister toward the open door. A moment later, the bus doors closed, the engine roared, and they were gone. I waited for the next bus, but no one could tell me when it would come. Roads were flooding fast, and the volunteers were visibly worried. I returned to my apartment through streets that were already turning into shallow rivers. By nightfall, the power went out, and the city became a landscape of shadows and the constant roar of water. The following days blurred together, rationing food, boiling water while it was still safe, and keeping candles lit as the damp air seeped into everything. From my window, I watched debris float by in the floodwaters. The sound of sirens came and went, but none of them reached my block. When the waters finally began to recede, the streets were unrecognizable, coated in mud and strewn with wreckage. My apartment had survived, but it bore the marks of the storm. I had survived too, though the emptiness in my chest told me that something far deeper than my possessions had been washed away. Disasters don't create selfishness. They simply strip away the excuses and show you exactly who people have always been. Long before the storm, long before the evacuation buses and the choice that left me standing alone in the rain, there had been a pattern. It was woven so tightly into the fabric of my life that I hardly noticed it when I was younger. At first, it was small things. A toy my sister wanted that I had been playing with, the last piece of dessert on the table, the better seat in the car. My mother would redirect those things toward her with a tone that suggested it was just the natural order of things. As I grew older, the pattern became harder to ignore. My sister, 3 years younger, had always been described as delicate, sensitive, someone who needed more attention. I, by contrast, was labeled independent. It was meant as a compliment, I think, a recognition that I could handle myself, but it came with an invisible cost. The label gave my family permission to overlook me, to assume I would be fine without the care or consideration my sister was given automatically. In school, I learned to work quietly and stay out of trouble. My report cards were steady lines of solid grades, never demanding the kind of urgent parental intervention my sister's occasional struggles in math or science seemed to provoke. When she needed a tutor, my mother rearranged her schedule to drive her to lessons twice a week. When I needed new supplies for an art project, I was told to make do with what we already had at home. Family gatherings were much the same. My sister's achievements, small or large, were met with open applause. My own accomplishments were acknowledged briefly, then folded into the background of the conversation. I told myself it didn't matter, that it was easier not to expect much. But there was always a quiet part of me that noticed, and that part kept track. By the time I was in my late teens, I had developed a habit of stepping back before anyone could push me aside. It was a form of self-preservation, a way to avoid the sting of being overlooked. When the choice came down to the two of us, I stepped away. I told myself I was being generous, that it was easier for me to adjust than for her. That was the story I believed for years. After high school, I moved out sooner than anyone expected. I worked 2 part-time jobs and rented a small room in a shared house. It wasn't much, but it was mine. My sister stayed home until she finished college, her expenses mostly covered by my parents. I heard about her milestones secondhand, her internships, her graduation, the trips my parents paid for to help her see the world. By then, I had stopped being surprised. The last time I had lived under the same roof as my family, I was 19. I had returned briefly between jobs, staying in my old room while I looked for work. My sister had already taken over most of the space, her clothes spilling into my closet, her makeup lined neatly along the edge of my desk. No one asked if I minded. That short return home reminded me why I had left in the first place. In the years that followed, my contact with my family became polite but distant. Holiday dinners, occasional phone calls, obligatory birthday cards. I built my own routines, my own small circle of people who saw me fully. I learned to enjoy solitude, to find satisfaction in simple things. I told myself that keeping my expectations low was the safest way to avoid disappointment. Still, there were moments when the old feelings returned, like when I saw my sister's life celebrated on social media by my mother, while my own milestones passed quietly. I had grown comfortable in my independence, but a small part of me still wanted to be chosen. That is why, when I saw them at the community center during the evacuation, some part of me still hoped for a different outcome. I thought maybe the years had shifted something, that a crisis of this scale might override the old hierarchy. But in that moment, nothing had changed. The choice was made exactly as it would have been when I was 10 or 15 or 20. She went forward. I stayed behind. In the days after the storm, as I sat in my candlelit apartment listening to the wind and the rain, I realized how deeply those patterns had shaped me. I had learned to survive on my own because I had been given no other option. My strength, the quality my mother often cited as the reason I could handle less care, had been born from neglect rather than nurture. The realization was both sobering and strangely empowering. It explained so much. The way I never asked for help, the way I instinctively took the harder path because I expected no one else to step in. But it also made me question how much of my life had been defined by someone else's view of me. Had I chosen independence, or had it been forced upon me? Thinking back, I could trace the line from every small moment of being passed over to the larger moment at the bus. The truth was, the storm didn't create that choice. It simply magnified it. The water outside was rising, but the tide that had shaped my life had been there all along. When the city began its slow recovery, I found myself reflecting less on what I had lost in the flood and more on what I had carried into it. The emotional weight was heavier than any physical burden. The storm had taken my sense of safety in my home, but my family had taken something far more enduring years ago, my sense that I could count on them. It was strange to realize that the abandonment during the evacuation hurt less because it was unexpected, and more because it confirmed what I had always known. There was a certain clarity in that confirmation, a harsh but honest light shining on the truth. I was not their priority, and I never had been. This knowledge did not make the days after the storm easier, but it gave them a certain focus. Survival was something I had practiced my entire life. Now I was simply applying those skills in the most literal sense. I rationed my food, kept my space organized, planned for contingencies. I waited for the water to recede, knowing no one from my family would come looking. And when it finally did, and the mud-covered streets stretched before me, I understood that the real recovery I needed had little to do with repairing my home. It was about accepting, fully and without excuse, the reality of where I stood in my own family's eyes and deciding what I would do with that knowledge. The bus's taillights were the last points of color in a world washed in gray. As they disappeared into the curtain of rain, I stood in the wet street, the cold seeping through every layer of clothing. I could still feel the heat from the bus's exhaust on my skin, fading as quickly as the chance to be on it. The noise of the engine was replaced by the pounding of the rain, steady and unrelenting. I remained there longer than I should have, my boots already heavy with water. It was as though moving too soon would make the moment real, and some part of me still clung to the illusion that the bus would return, that they might call my name. But the crowd dispersed, those left behind scattering in different directions, and I realized there was nothing left to wait for. The walk back to my apartment felt longer than it had on the way out. The rain pressed against me like a wall, and the wind clawed at the edges of my hood. Small rivers ran along the gutters, pulling leaves, paper, and pieces of broken branches toward the storm drains that were already choking. Streetlights flickered and dimmed, casting everything in a patchwork of light and shadow. When I reached my building, the front steps were slick with water. I climbed them carefully, my legs aching with fatigue I hadn't noticed until I stopped moving. Inside, the air felt damp and cool, and the familiar scent of my apartment was overpowered by the smell of wet clothing and mud clinging to my boots. I peeled off the soaked layers and set them near the door, knowing they might never fully dry in the humid air. The first thing I did was check my supplies. I had food for maybe 5 days if I stretched it, mostly canned goods, pasta, and a few bottles of water. The tap was still running, but I filled every container I could find in case that changed. I placed candles on the counters, the bathroom sink, the bedside table. The sound of the rain was constant, a low roar that made it difficult to tell if the wind was rising or if the river was closer. That night, the power went out. It wasn't sudden. Lights dimmed once, twice, then faded into darkness. The refrigerator hummed for a moment before falling silent. I lit 2 candles and set them in the kitchen, watching their light dance across the walls. The shadows made the room feel smaller, as though the walls were leaning in. The hours crawled by. I lay in bed, fully dressed, listening to the noises outside. Sometimes it was the slap of rain against the glass, sometimes the crack of something breaking in the wind. Once there was the sound of rushing water much closer than it should have been. My heart pounded, but I stayed still, waiting for the sound to pass. It did, eventually, though I wasn't sure if it had moved away or if I had simply grown used to it. By morning, the world outside my window had changed. The street was gone, replaced by a slow brown current carrying bits of debris, a child's ball, a plastic chair, pieces of wood that might once have been part of a fence. The water wasn't deep enough to reach my building's 2nd floor, but it was high enough to cut me off entirely. The sound of sirens drifted from somewhere far away, too faint to be meant for me. I fell into a routine. Breakfast was small, half a granola bar or a slice of bread. I rationed water strictly, reminding myself that I didn't know when it might run out. The air grew heavier with each day, the damp seeping into the walls, into my hair, into my bones. In the evenings, I lit the candles early, unwilling to watch the daylight fade into darkness unprepared. I read from the one novel I hadn't yet finished, the pages curling slightly from the humidity. When my eyes grew tired, I would sit by the window and watch the water move. Sometimes I thought I saw shapes in it, branches, animals, maybe even people, but the light was never good enough to be sure. On the third day, I heard the thump of a helicopter somewhere overhead. I went to the window, scanning the sky, but the sound passed quickly, lost in the storm. That night, the temperature dropped sharply. I wrapped myself in 2 blankets and moved a chair closer to the candlelight, trying to hold on to the small pockets of warmth it provided. I thought of the shelter where my mother and sister must have been, the warmth of dry clothes, the sound of people moving and talking around them. I pictured them eating hot food, sleeping without fear of the water rising. The image should have comforted me, but it didn't. It only made the walls of my apartment feel colder. Sleep came in short bursts. I woke often, startled by sounds, distant crashes, the creak of the building shifting, the strange, hollow knocking that sometimes echoed through the flooded street. Each time I would lie still, listening, my mind darting between hope and dread. Hope that it was help, dread that it was something else entirely. By the 5th day, the water began to recede, slowly at first, then more noticeably. The current weakened, revealing the outlines of the road beneath. It left behind a thick layer of mud and debris, everything coated in a dull brown film. The smell changed too, less of rain, more of rot. I ventured outside for the first time since returning from the community center. The steps were slick with mud and the ground squelched under my boots. The silence was startling without the constant roar of the storm. I could hear my own breathing, the faint hum of a generator somewhere nearby, and the occasional call of a bird testing the air. The damage was everywhere. Cars sat half submerged where they had stalled, their windows streaked with silt. Pieces of roofing lay scattered across yards. A tree had fallen across the road 2 blocks away, its roots jutting into the air like broken ribs. I knew then that even when the city reopened its roads and the buses began to run again, things would not be the same. The storm had rearranged the landscape, both outside and inside me. It had stripped away the illusion that I could still occupy some middle ground in my family's priorities. The choice had been made in the rain, and it was final. That night, I lit the last of my candles and sat in the quiet. The water was gone, but its absence didn't feel like victory. It felt like the end of something I had been holding on to far too long. When the floodwaters finally pulled back, they left behind a city that looked like it had been scraped raw. The familiar streets were coated in a thick layer of mud that clung to everything it touched. The air was heavy with the smell of rot and wet wood, mixed with the faint metallic tang of debris rusting in the sun. The silence was different now. It was not the muffled quiet of a storm. It was the hollow stillness of a place stripped bare. I walked carefully through the wreckage of my neighborhood, my boots sinking into the mud with each step. Shards of glass glittered faintly in the weak daylight, half buried in the muck. The homes I passed all bore the same mark of the storm's passage: windows shattered, doors warped, furniture dragged from one end of a room to another by the current. In one driveway, a car sat at an unnatural angle, its hood crushed by the weight of a fallen tree. Inside my own building, the lower level had been gutted by the flood. The once bright hallway was dark and damp, the paint peeling in long strips from the walls. Water had warped the wooden steps, and I climbed them slowly, testing each one before putting my weight down. My apartment on the 2nd floor had been spared the worst of it, but the smell had found its way inside, an inescapable reminder of what lay just beyond my door. I started with the most basic tasks. Every surface was wiped down, every item checked for water damage. The refrigerator was useless now, its contents long spoiled. I filled garbage bags with what I could, tying them tightly before stacking them near the door. Without regular trash collection, the piles around the neighborhood were growing, attracting flies that buzzed lazily in the thick air. The days blurred into one another, marked only by the rhythm of cleaning and the slow reintroduction of sounds to the streets. A generator hummed from somewhere down the block. The crunch of boots on gravel announced the arrival of small groups, residents returning to salvage what they could, or volunteers carrying supplies. They moved quickly, their eyes scanning the damage, as if unsure where to focus in the face of so much ruin. I kept my interactions brief. Without power, phone service was unreliable, and I had no real way to reach out to anyone, even if I wanted to. My family had not come. No note, no message slipped under the door, no knock. Each day that passed without a sign from them made the space between us wider, more permanent. On the 3rd day after the waters receded, I ventured farther from home. The grocery store, once bright and bustling, was a hollow shell. The aisles were dark, the floor coated in a film of mud, the shelves stripped bare. Shopping carts lay overturned near the entrance, their wheels clogged with debris. I picked through what little remained, cans dented but sealed, a few dusty bottles of water. I carried them home in a backpack, the straps cutting into my shoulders. Back in my apartment, I set the salvage supplies on the counter and allowed myself a moment to breathe. The work of survival was quieter now, less frantic than during the storm, but it demanded a different kind of endurance. Every decision felt deliberate. How much water to use for cooking, how long to burn a candle before extinguishing it, how to pace myself through the long hours between sunrise and sunset. At night, the darkness was complete. Without streetlights, the city became an expanse of shadow, broken only by the occasional flicker of a flashlight or the brief glow of a lantern in a neighboring window. I learned to navigate my apartment by memory, moving carefully to avoid knocking into furniture. The quiet was deep enough that I could hear my own breathing, the creak of the floorboards beneath my feet, the faint rustle of the wind outside. It was during one of these nights that I began to understand the weight of what had happened. The storm had taken my sense of safety in the physical world, but my family had taken something far less tangible and far more lasting. Their absence was not a surprise, not really, but it was a confirmation of a truth I had spent years trying to soften. There was no misunderstanding, no miscommunication to explain it away. When the choice was made, they had not chosen me. In the daylight, I worked to keep my hands busy. I scrubbed the floors, aired out the apartment as best I could, patched small leaks in the windows with plastic sheeting. I sorted my remaining possessions into piles. What could be saved? What was too far gone? The act of deciding what to keep and what to discard became a quiet meditation, a way to exert control over something in a world where control had become scarce. Occasionally, I would hear the distant whir of a helicopter or the low rumble of a truck making its way through the damaged streets. These sounds were reminders that the outside world still existed, even if it felt far away. But no matter how many times I listened for footsteps outside my door, the ones I longed for never came. By the end of the first week, the mud in the streets had begun to dry, cracking into jagged patterns under the heat of the sun. The smell shifted again, carrying the sharp edge of dust along with the lingering rot. I took longer walks, mapping the changes in my neighborhood like charting a coastline that had been redrawn. Some houses would never be repaired, others stood ready for the slow, grueling work of restoration. I thought about what restoration would mean for me. My apartment could be cleaned, the broken things replaced, the walls repainted, but the kind of damage done in the days before and after the storm was harder to name and harder still to repair. It was the kind of wound that didn't show in photographs, the kind you carried quietly until one day you realized it had reshaped you entirely. At night, lying in the dark, I would picture the bus again. The rain, the crowd, the way my mother's hand rested on my sister's shoulder as they stepped forward together. I could see it as clearly as if it had happened an hour ago, and each time the scene ended the same way. The door closing, the engine roaring, the bus disappearing into the storm without me. The city was healing in slow, uneven steps, and so was I. But I knew that when the lights came back on and the streets were cleared, I would not be the same person who had stood in that line. The storm had taken more than my home. It had taken the last threads tying me to a place in my family that never truly existed. In the days that followed, the work of cleaning and repairing became a constant rhythm. Each morning, I would step out into the thin light and assess what still needed to be done. The physical labor kept my hands occupied, but my mind wandered freely, drawn again and again to pieces of my past that mirrored the present more than I wanted to admit. The smell of damp wood in my apartment reminded me of the cabin trips my family used to take in the summers. Back then, the rain was something to laugh about, a temporary interruption in a week of fishing and hiking. But I remembered clearly the time I slipped on the dock and scraped my knee open. My mother's first instinct had been to turn to my sister, asking if she was frightened by the sight of blood. It was only after my sister was comforted that my mother finally came to me. That memory, one I had thought insignificant, returned now with a sharpness that surprised me. The details were all there, the cold sting of the water on my leg, the grain of the wood beneath my palms, the faint taste of copper when I bit my lip to stop myself from crying. As I moved through my apartment, deciding what to salvage and what to discard, I thought about how often I had been forced to make similar decisions in my own life. When my parents had to choose between helping me with college tuition or helping my sister buy a car, they had chosen the car. I had taken on student loans without complaint, convincing myself it was better not to depend on them. The same pattern had repeated so many times that I could recite it without effort. My needs were negotiable, my sister's were not. The storm had stripped away so much of the city's facade, walls peeled back, foundations exposed. It had done the same to me, pulling away the layers I had built to protect myself from old truths. Walking through my neighborhood, I saw gutted homes where the interiors were laid bare for anyone passing by to see. Some were neatly stripped, ready for rebuilding. Others looked as though the storm had ripped through them in rage, leaving nothing but splintered wood and mud-soaked debris. I couldn't help but see myself in those ruins. Certain smells, sounds, and textures worked like keys, unlocking moments I hadn't thought about in years. The sound of my boots squelching in the mud brought back the image of my sister's birthday party when she was 10. It had rained that day too, and the backyard was a mess of wet grass and puddles. I had offered to help set up the chairs, but my mother told me to stay inside so I wouldn't ruin the decorations. Hours later, when the guests arrived, my name was barely mentioned. My role had been to stay out of the way to ensure everything went smoothly for someone else's celebration. Now, standing ankle-deep in the remnants of the flood, I realized how well I had learned that role. Even in survival, I instinctively thought first about how to avoid disrupting others, how to stay contained within my own space. The slow, grinding work of recovery became an exercise in control. Each bag of debris I carried down the stairs was a decision made, a small step toward shaping my environment again. But even as I worked, the storm inside my head refused to quiet. It replayed the bus scene like a loop, me standing in the rain, watching the door close, hearing the engine as it pulled away. That image bled into other memories. The time in middle school when my art project was selected for a district showcase, but my parents couldn't attend because my sister had a soccer game. The time in high school when I landed my first part-time job and no one asked me how my first day went. The time after I moved into my first apartment when my mother stopped by unexpectedly, only to spend the entire visit on the phone with my sister. The storm had not created my isolation, it had simply magnified it. The floodwaters had been a mirror reflecting back the truth of what had always been there. And just like the mud coating the streets, the residue of that truth clung stubbornly, refusing to wash away. In the evenings when the work was done and the light faded, I would sit in the one chair I had kept near the window. The city beyond was slowly returning to life, trucks clearing debris, neighbors venturing out to check on each other, but the gulf between me and the people I was supposed to call family felt wider than ever. I found myself wondering if I even wanted to bridge it anymore. I realized that part of what hurt was not just being left behind, but knowing that if the roles had been reversed, I would have chosen differently. I would have made space for them, even if it meant standing in the rain myself. That was the difference between us. My instinct was to protect, theirs was to preserve their comfort. The rebuilding around me was visible and measurable. Roofs were patched, windows replaced, walls painted over in fresh coats. But my own rebuilding was slower, invisible to anyone but me. It was in the way I stopped expecting a message from my family. It was in the way I began to think of my apartment not as something temporarily damaged, but as a space entirely my own, one I would shape without compromise. One afternoon, I found a photograph wedged between two books on my shelf. It was from years ago, me, my sister, and my mother at a picnic. We were sitting on a blanket, the sun high above us. My sister was in the middle, my mother leaning toward her. I was on the edge of the frame, smiling but looking away from the camera. I stared at that image for a long time before slipping it back between the books. Some memories are worth keeping for what they teach you, not for the warmth they bring. The storm had taken away much of what I owned, but in its aftermath, it also stripped away my illusions. It left behind the raw truth of my history, exposed like the studs and beams in the gutted houses around me. I could choose to rebuild exactly as things had been before, or I could accept that some structures weren't worth restoring. That choice, at least, was mine. The days after the storm settled into a kind of uneasy stillness. The urgent noise of rescue efforts faded into the background, replaced by the slower, quieter sounds of rebuilding, hammering, the low rumble of trucks, the scrape of shovels in the drying mud. Life was returning to the streets in fragments, but the rhythm was uneven. I noticed how neighbors reconnected almost instinctively. People who had not spoken in years stopped to exchange a few words on the sidewalk. They swapped supplies, offered ladders, shared meals cooked over camp stoves. I was greeted politely, even included in offers of help, but I remained an island, not by their design, but by mine. My focus was inward now, centered on the work of building something that would belong to me alone. There was still no word from my family. I did not expect it anymore. At first, their silence had felt like a heavy weight pressing against my chest, but over time, it began to feel different. It was less like something crushing me and more like an empty space I no longer had to fill. The absence became a kind of clarity. Without the distraction of waiting for a call or a visit, I could see the years behind me more plainly. The signs had been there all along, moments when I was left out of decisions, when my milestones were brushed aside, when I was expected to adjust quietly so someone else could be comfortable. The storm had simply stripped away the small acts of politeness that had once disguised these truths. I began to approach my days with a kind of deliberate precision. Mornings were for repairs and cleaning, afternoons for errands or salvaging what could be found in the few stores that had reopened. I learned to navigate the damaged streets, memorizing which blocks were still impassable and which had been cleared. I rationed supplies not out of fear anymore, but out of habit, a way of maintaining control in an environment that had once been unpredictable. The apartment, though still scarred by the storm, became a place of quiet focus. I rearranged the furniture, placing the chair I used most near the window so I could watch the neighborhood from a comfortable distance. The kitchen counters, once cluttered, were now stripped to essentials, what I needed and nothing more. It felt cleaner, not just in the physical sense, but in the way it reflected my priorities. Sometimes I thought about what it would mean if they did reach out. If my mother or my sister suddenly appeared, offering an explanation, would I want to hear it? I realized that I would not. Any explanation would be too small for the weight of what had been done, too shallow to fill the space their absence had carved into my life. This understanding brought an unexpected sense of calm. The sharp edge of hurt dulled into something steadier, something I could live with. I no longer needed to brace myself for the next disappointment, because I had stopped giving them the power to deliver it. The city around me mirrored this transformation. Some buildings would be repaired quickly, their facades polished until no one could tell they had ever been damaged. Others would remain empty shells for months, maybe years, their broken windows and sagging roofs marking them as places that would never be the same. In both cases, the storm's impact would always be part of their history, whether visible or not. On walks through the neighborhood, I noticed how nature had left its mark as well. Trees that had been uprooted during the storm lay like open wounds along the sidewalks. In some places, water lines were etched into brick walls high enough to make me wonder how anything inside had survived. These scars, though silent, spoke of survival. I began to think of my own survival in similar terms. The damage was there, etched into my history, but I could decide how much of it would remain visible. I could leave certain parts behind, strip them away like the ruined drywall in the apartments below mine, or I could keep them, not as burdens, but as reminders. As the weeks passed, the distance from my family became less of a gap to cross and more of a border I chose not to step over. I did not delete their numbers from my phone, but I stopped glancing at it with expectation. I kept old photographs in a box, not on display. I let the past exist without letting it dictate the terms of my present. There was a strange freedom in knowing I owed them nothing. I did not have to explain my choices, did not have to soften my words, did not have to adjust my life to fit into the narrow space they had once allowed me. The absence of their approval or recognition no longer stung, it simply no longer mattered. One evening, I stood by the window as the sun dipped below the horizon. The sky was streaked with pale gold, the air still carrying the faint scent of mud, but warmer now, less oppressive. In the distance, I could see people gathering in small groups, their conversations punctuated by laughter. The world was moving forward, even here, even after everything. I realized I was moving forward too, though in a quieter way. My steps were smaller, my progress less visible, but it was there. Each day I spent focused on my own needs. Each task I completed without waiting for someone else's approval was part of it. The storm had left me with less than I started with, but also with something I hadn't known I needed, a complete and final separation from the expectation that my family would ever be different. It was a truth I could live with, and one I would not trade for the false comfort of pretending otherwise. By the time the power returned to the building and the streetlights flickered back on, I knew I was living in a different kind of home. Not just a repaired apartment, but a space that belonged entirely to me. And for the first time in years, that felt like enough. When the city officially reopened, it did not happen with fanfare or celebration. There was no single moment when the storm was declared over. Instead, the change was gradual, marked by the return of small details, the low hum of traffic, the faint glow of store signs, the slow reappearance of people on the streets. For weeks, my world had been contained within the limits of my neighborhood. Every errand was done on foot, every decision made with the awareness that resources were finite. The reappearance of buses and open shops felt strange at first, as if the world beyond my small perimeter was unfamiliar territory. I began to take longer walks, following streets I hadn't visited since before the storm. Some looked almost unchanged, their damage hidden behind fresh paint and repaired storefronts. Others bore the marks of deeper wounds, boarded windows, sagging roofs, handwritten signs announcing that businesses had closed permanently. The city felt uneven, a patchwork of recovery and loss. Each time I ventured farther, I felt a subtle tension in my body, a readiness to turn back if something felt unsafe. That instinct had sharpened during the days of isolation, when every choice carried weight. Now, even with the streets dry and the skies clear, I moved with the same measured caution. Supplies were easier to find now. Shelves that had once been stripped bare were slowly filling again. The first time I stepped into a grocery store with working lights and refrigeration, I felt the air conditioning brush against my skin and realized how much I had grown used to the still, heavy air of my apartment. I shopped deliberately, avoiding excess, choosing only what I knew I would use. The idea of waste felt almost wrong after so many days of rationing. Neighbors I barely knew before the storm stopped to greet me as I passed. Some offered brief updates on repairs or mentioned community meetings being organized to discuss flood prevention. I listened politely, but I kept my distance from these new networks forming around me. I had spent too many years trying to belong in spaces that did not value me to mistake polite conversation for genuine connection. At home, the sound of the city filtered through the open window. It was a different kind of noise than before the storm, less casual, more deliberate. People seemed to be moving with purpose, focused on rebuilding, on re-establishing what they had lost. The pace was slower than the pre-storm rush, but there was a determination beneath it that felt familiar. I noticed how much my own pace had changed. Before, I had moved quickly through my days, fitting tasks into narrow windows of time. Now, I approached each activity with a kind of steadiness, as if the storm had taught me to measure my energy differently. I no longer felt the pull to rush toward every opportunity or to say yes to every invitation. The absence of my family's demands made space for something I had not felt in years: quiet ownership of my own time. There were still signs of the storm everywhere. Along the river, the waterline was etched high into the retaining walls, a permanent reminder of how far the flood had risen. Parks were littered with debris that had washed in from miles away. The air still carried a faint dampness, especially in the early mornings, as if the city itself had not yet dried completely. The bus station near the community center had reopened, but every time I walked past it, I felt the weight of that day pressing in. The image of the bus pulling away remained vivid, unchanged by the passing weeks. I had thought the feeling might fade once I saw the place under normal circumstances, but it didn't. If anything, the contrast between the busy, functioning station and the chaos of that day made the memory sharper. As more people returned to their routines, conversations began to shift away from the storm. Neighbors spoke about upcoming events, store owners about seasonal sales, community leaders about future development plans. The storm was still present, but it was becoming a backdrop instead of the central focus. I found myself doing the same in my own mind, placing the storm in the past, even as its effects remained in the present. There was no contact from my family. Weeks had turned into over a month, and still nothing. The silence was no longer surprising, but it still carried a kind of finality. I no longer imagined scenarios in which they might reach out. The absence had become part of the landscape, like the boarded windows that no one had gotten around to replacing. I began making small plans for the future, nothing ambitious, just steps toward stability. I organized my finances, considered new ways to use my living space, looked into volunteer opportunities in the city's recovery efforts. I didn't feel the need to explain these choices to anyone, and that freedom made the planning feel lighter, unburdened by external expectations. Sometimes, while walking through the recovering streets, I would pass groups of people gathered in conversation, their voices carrying laughter or shared frustration. I didn't feel excluded from these moments, but I also didn't feel the urge to step into them. My solitude was no longer something to escape from. It had become a deliberate choice. By late in the second month, the city's rhythm had stabilized enough that the storm no longer dictated every decision. Yet, in quiet moments, I could still feel its presence in the way I moved, the way I thought, the way I measured my trust. The storm had stripped away illusions, leaving only what was essential. And while much of what I had lost could be replaced or rebuilt, there was a part of me that no longer wanted to restore everything exactly as it had been. The world beyond my apartment was open to me again, but I stepped into it carefully, choosing my direction with intention. I no longer measured my worth by my place in someone else's priorities. The distance that once hurt had become a boundary I could protect. The storm had changed the city, but it had also changed me in ways that no repair crew could undo. I carried those changes with me as I moved forward, not as scars to hide, but as proof of survival. The weeks following the city's reopening felt like a slow awakening. The urgency of survival had passed, replaced by the steady work of rebuilding, not just structures, but lives. For many, this meant restoring what they had before. For me, it meant deciding, perhaps for the first time, what I actually wanted to carry forward. I had spent so much of my life adapting to other people's needs that I had rarely paused to consider my own without compromise. The storm had stripped away those expectations, and in their absence, I could see my choices more clearly. I no longer felt the familiar pull to seek approval before making a move. An email from the nonprofit where I worked arrived one morning announcing that a senior coordinator position had opened. In the past, I might have dismissed the idea immediately, telling myself that I wasn't ready or that someone else was more deserving. But as I read the description, I felt a quiet certainty settle in. I knew the work. I understood the systems. I had kept the office running through challenges before, without recognition. The thought of applying brought a mix of nerves and calm. It was a risk, yes, but it was also an act of choosing myself over the voice in my head that had always urged me to step aside. I began drafting my application that afternoon, taking breaks only to tend to the small maintenance tasks still needed in my apartment. Outside, the city continued its uneven recovery. Entire blocks were still waiting for repairs, while others had returned to near normal. The contrast reminded me that progress wasn't about speed, but about direction. I didn't need to rush into everything at once. What mattered was that I was moving with intention. I also began to invest more in my physical space. The apartment that had been just a place to sleep was slowly becoming a place to live fully. I replaced the chair by the window with one that fit my body better, bought a sturdy table to replace the water-damaged one, and sorted my shelves so that only books and objects that held meaning remained. It was a kind of quiet reclamation, each change reinforcing the sense that this was mine, unshared and unquestioned. Neighbors noticed, in small ways. A woman down the hall commented on the plant I had placed outside my door, its leaves a deep green against the neutral hallway walls. Another nodded toward the new curtains in my living room window as she passed in the street. I acknowledged these moments with a polite smile, but I didn't feel the need to explain myself. These changes were not for anyone else's approval. Work at the nonprofit became busier as the city's recovery efforts expanded. I took on tasks that stretched my abilities not because I was pressured to, but because I wanted to see what I could do. I stayed later some evenings, not out of obligation, but because I was invested in the projects I had chosen to lead. For the first time, I was not measuring my worth by how quietly I could support others, but by how clearly I could stand in my own capability. Evenings remained my own. I kept the habit of walking through the neighborhood at sunset, noting the gradual changes, the boarded windows replaced with glass, the sound of laughter spilling from open doors, the smell of fresh paint on newly repaired walls. Each transformation reminded me that rebuilding was not about restoring everything exactly as it was, but about deciding what was worth bringing back. I realized that this was true for me as well. There were parts of my old life I no longer wanted, relationships I would not revive, habits I would not return to. The distance from my family was no longer an open wound. It was a closed door that I had locked from my side. By the end of the month, I submitted my application for the promotion. I didn't announce it to anyone, didn't look for validation or reassurance. It was a decision made entirely in the quiet of my own mind, rooted in the understanding that I could shape my life without waiting for someone else to choose me. Whatever the outcome, I knew that the act of applying had already shifted something fundamental. I was no longer simply surviving the choices others had made for me. I was making my own. The weeks after I submitted the promotion application were filled with an odd mixture of anticipation and calm. I was aware of the possibility of change, yet I did not feel the familiar anxiety that used to accompany moments like this. I had learned, slowly, that the outcome of any decision mattered less than the fact that it was mine to make. Each day I walked to work through streets that still carried the marks of the storm. Some buildings had been patched and painted so completely that, at first glance, no one would guess they had been underwater just months ago. Others remained shells, waiting for repairs, or left abandoned altogether. I thought often about how recovery worked on both scales, the visible repairs that others could see and the invisible work done inside, where no one else could witness the progress. I was doing both kinds of work in my own life. The visible part was clear enough. My apartment was clean, orderly, and increasingly reflective of my own choices. I had replaced or repurposed what the storm had damaged, choosing only pieces that served me well. The invisible part was slower, but no less important. It was in the way I carried myself through the day, in the way I measured my time, in the quiet certainty that I no longer had to live in reaction to other people's priorities. The silence from my family had stretched so long that it now felt permanent. There was no sharp pain attached to it anymore, only a steady understanding that this was the reality. I had stopped trying to interpret their absence as a message or a statement. It was simply the truth, and it freed me from the cycle of waiting and wondering. At work, I found myself stepping into roles I had once avoided. I led meetings, coordinated teams, and spoke up when I had ideas. The nonprofit's recovery projects demanded organization and clarity, and I realized I had both. My ability to stay composed under pressure, honed over years of managing my own life without much support, was suddenly a strength others could rely on. Outside of work, I began to explore the city again in deliberate ways. I visited parks that had reopened, walked along the river to see where the waterline had been, and took photographs of buildings mid-repair. These walks were not about nostalgia or documentation. They were about understanding the landscape as it was now. The city was no longer the same as before, and neither was I. There were moments of loneliness, but they no longer felt like weaknesses. I had stopped equating solitude with failure. Instead, it became a space I could fill intentionally, with books, with music, with the sound of my own thoughts uninterrupted. I realized how much energy I had once spent trying to avoid being alone and how different that felt now that I could choose it. The promotion decision took longer than expected. I heard from coworkers that there were many applicants, some with more years in the organization than I had. In the past, that would have been enough to make me pull back, to convince myself I was already out of the running. But this time, I let the process unfold without trying to preempt its outcome. I spent my evenings refining the systems in my apartment the same way I was refining them at work. Small adjustments, a better way to store supplies, a rearrangement of the space to make it flow more easily, were quiet but meaningful improvements. They reminded me that growth did not always arrive in sudden leaps. Sometimes it was the accumulation of small, deliberate choices. The city's recovery had reached a point where the storm was no longer the first thing people mentioned in conversation. It was becoming part of the background, a shared history that everyone carried in different ways. I noticed that for some, it had become a reference point for resilience. For others, it remained a wound they couldn't stop reopening. I understood both. In my own mind, the storm was no longer a story about destruction, but about revelation. It had exposed the fragile foundations I had been standing on for years, the expectation that my family would be there, the belief that I had to earn my place in their care. Losing those illusions had been painful, but it had also cleared the ground for something stronger. One weekend, I took the bus to a part of the city I hadn't visited since before the storm. The streets there were narrow, lined with small shops and cafes, many of them freshly painted. The air smelled of fresh bread and coffee, the kind of scents that made the place feel alive again. I walked slowly, letting the afternoon sun warm my face, and thought about how strange it was to feel at home in a place that had once been just another part of the city. That day, I realized something that had been forming quietly for weeks. I was no longer trying to rebuild my life to match what it had been before. I was building something entirely different, something that existed on my own terms. The absence of my family had left a space, and I had filled it not with substitutes, but with the solid weight of my own choices. When the email finally arrived with the subject line, "Coordinator Position Decision," I felt no rush of fear. I opened it calmly, knowing that whatever it said, the person reading it was not the same one who had once stood in the rain, waiting for someone else to choose her. The city was moving forward. So was I. And for the first time, it felt like we were moving at the same pace. The morning the promotion email arrived, the city was washed in pale gold light. It wasn't the heavy silence of those early days after the storm, but a calmer stillness, the kind that comes when the air is clear and the streets are beginning to feel alive again. I opened my inbox with no sense of urgency, my coffee cooling beside me, and saw the subject line that would have once sent my heart racing. The words confirming the offer were simple, but they carried the weight of something much larger. I read them twice, not because I didn't believe them, but because I wanted to feel the truth settle into place. This was not luck, not a matter of being chosen unexpectedly. It was the result of steady, deliberate work, choices I had made without waiting for approval, steps I had taken entirely on my own terms. The role came with new responsibilities, a broader reach in the projects I would oversee, and a salary that would allow me to move forward with more security than I'd had in years. I knew it would be challenging, but the thought didn't intimidate me. I had already navigated challenges far greater without a safety net. At the office, the weeks that followed were full. I managed teams working on post-storm recovery initiatives, coordinated with city officials, and developed plans to support neighborhoods still struggling to rebuild. The work was demanding, but it felt purposeful in a way that went beyond the job description. Each task was a reminder that I could stand fully in my own capability, that I could lead without shrinking myself to fit into someone else's comfort. At home, my apartment reflected the same transformation. The chaos and dampness of those first post-storm weeks were gone. The space was orderly, light-filled, and intentional. Every object had a place and a reason to be there. It was no longer just where I lived. It was a space that mirrored who I had become. I did not hear from my family. Months passed, and the silence remained uninterrupted. There was a time when that absence would have shadowed even my brightest moments, when I would have looked for ways to fold them into my success or to prove my worth through my accomplishments. But the truth was simpler now. They were not part of this chapter of my life, and I no longer needed them to be. The distance between us no longer felt like something imposed on me. It was a boundary I maintained because it preserved my peace. The storm had forced me to face the reality that their presence in my life had always come at the cost of myself. Letting go had not been easy, but it had been necessary, and in the space that followed, I had built something stronger. There were still moments, brief and quiet, when the old ache returned, a passing thought about what it might be like to share my new role with them, or to have them see the apartment I had rebuilt. But those moments no longer held me in place. They came and went like the tide, reminders of what had been, but not instructions for where to go next. Outside, the city had reached a rhythm again. Markets were open, parks were full, and the sound of construction was a steady backdrop. The scars of the storm remained, faint water lines on some buildings, the absence of shops that would never reopen, but they were part of the landscape now. The city had not returned to what it was before. It had moved forward, altered but whole. I thought often about how my own life mirrored that change. The person I had been before the storm was gone, not because she had been destroyed, but because she had been remade. The quiet resilience I carried now was not the kind that came from enduring for someone else's benefit. It was the kind that grew when you finally decide to live for yourself. On weekends, I explored parts of the city I had never visited before, letting curiosity guide me. I tried new cafes, wandered through small art galleries, and walked along streets where the history was written in the architecture. These outings weren't about filling time. They were about expanding my sense of place in the world. The bus station that had once been the site of my deepest abandonment became just another landmark I passed on occasion. The memory of that day had not disappeared, but its weight had changed. It no longer felt like the defining moment of my life. It was simply one of many that had shaped me, a part of my history that I carried without letting it dictate my future. The storm had taken much: security, possessions, the last illusions about my family's loyalty. But in the clearing that followed, I had found something more valuable: the freedom to build a life that was entirely my own. I no longer waited for someone else to make space for me. I took up the space I needed, without apology. As the year came to a close, I stood at my window one evening, watching the lights of the city flicker against the dark. The streets below were busy but calm, the air cool and steady. It struck me then that I was no longer living in the shadow of the storm. I was living in the life I had chosen to keep. If this story resonated with you, please like and subscribe to support this channel and share it with someone who might need to hear it. Your voice matters here, and your story deserves to be told.